All right, members, good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. All right, good evening, everybody. In front of you, you should have a blue folder with a number of items, and so I'll just quickly remind you, let you know what all of those are, then we'll go ahead and get started. And Scott has found his red, yellow, green card. You should all be excited.
No, I've got 2 cents.
Take away your red.
Oh boy. All right, first is, so in the blue folder, you have your exit slope questionnaire. You should also have meeting minutes from the meeting on the 21st, a document that incorporates or is a recap of the debrief of the community workshop from Grant. In addition to that, you should also have the agenda. On the right side, you should have a PowerPoint, which is our version 2 of the value statements updated from the discussion we had last week. Inside as well is what we're calling version 1A of the values document, which is the original values that we worked on last week and incorporates all of the feedback that you all gave Joe, Pamela, and I between Thursday and last Tuesday. So this is all of the feedback that you all gave us on Tuesday and any emails that were submitted to us by Tuesday. So this is the record of everything. So because tonight is for us to take a look at and see, does version 2 accurately incorporate all of the feedback that you gave us? So part of the intent tonight is for us to say, did we get it right? What did we miss? And hopefully everyone will help us be able to work in some language that gets us to that point. In addition to that, the 2 additional documents are in fact the full data results from the survey questions, specifically around the questions regarding boundary review that Wendy Willis and others will walk through later this evening. So just to quickly walk through what the agenda outcomes are for tonight. First is to get a shared understanding of the boundary-related questions from the PPS 2025 survey. 2, in response to last week's discussion, to get an understanding of the refined scope for D-BRAC's work and some clarity and guidance on grade configuration. And 3 is continuing our discussion of the framework elements and hoping to get some real clarity and direct movement on where those value statements are. So with that, first I'll turn it over to Jim to facilitate our next agenda item, which is public comment.
Thank you, Jason. As is the custom with D-BRAC, they have time at the beginning of the meetings for public comment for 2 minutes. And we have a green card from Debbie Flinders. Come on up, Debbie. And she's got a handout that I'll pass around as she gets started.
Thank you so much. Good evening. Thank you so much for your time and consideration. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I came last week and observed kind of the conversations that were happening. And one of the comments that was made while you all were talking about the debrief from the community forum, and it carried over a little bit into the values conversation, was around whether or not there was enough emphasis on the view from a student's perspective as we're working through this, because there's a lot of parent and community involvement, but how do we make sure that the students are adequately represented? So I took that to heart and looked at the values, and one of the things that was really striking to me was, I think you've done a really great job of a pretty complex situation to really put some values around what's important and consideration of the boundary conversations. But the one thing that I noticed really wasn't as represented as I would have expected was really that sense of community and how the community, the importance of the community relative to the social and emotional development that happens throughout school, and how that manifests itself in the different ages and schools as you're going through, and how a community can be very, very important in helping students have confidence and support and feel like they're part of an organization and a community that's going to help them be successful at school. So I maybe overstepped my bounds a little bit, but I've put a proposal together just for consideration, or really just to start conversation, hopefully, around a potential kind of stab at what that could look like. So specifically, you have it in front of you, but really neighborhood schools should foster inclusive communities that support every student's ability to achieve success. And then I gave some examples of how, right? So by the welcoming environment, there was a lot of conversation, I heard a lot of conversation about that last time. Fostering constructive relationships. That can be peer-to-peer, that can be with teachers, with other professionals that are working with the students, those kinds of things. Consistency of support structure, so they have anticipation of how things are going to transition from year to year for those that are struggling in particular. But even for those who are doing new things and they're experiencing new things, and maybe I need help this time. And then stability as much as possible with that cohort as they're taking their journey. Because as a student, one of the things that I did was I figured out who was really good at certain things and who could I help with certain things as we were going through school. So we were kind of in it together, and I will tell you, when I went to the school in the 70s, teamwork wasn't quite the emphasis that it is now, which is great. I love to see teamwork now. But there's still things that you get from being part of that team and knowing who you can rely on and have that support structure in place. So I'd like to request that you guys have a conversation about community and how that fits with the values that you're talking about and considering, because I do believe that even from a boundary perspective, I think that's just one more factor to consider in the process. Thank you so much for your time.
Terrific. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So before we plunge into the next thing, I want to take just 1 minute to remind our group of the work we did to create a community amongst the committee here, amongst D-BRAC. And a couple of the things I just want to highlight. Student-centered, that was something that was of paramount importance for us. And checking our assumptions. A lot of this work is complex, it's complicated. It's important for us to check our assumptions. And speak respectfully, listen respectfully, manage your airtime, seek to understand. All of these are things that this group went through a really good process that Hector helped facilitate to help us be a group together and be an effective one and an efficient one. And we are working towards a common goal to provide the superintendent with some advice. And we want to acknowledge that neighborhood boundaries have a long history, and in many cases it's based on race. And we also want to, I like the assume noble intent and goodwill, because we're starting to get to the point in the process where we're starting to narrow in on some results and advice that we want to give, and we're approaching a moment of decision. And so that's when the stress can go up, that's when we can start to feel uncomfortable, and we need to assume noble intent with each other and goodwill. So we've got these, and these have been up at every meeting, but it's been a few meetings since anyone's called them out. And just a 1 minute sort of reminder for us about the work that we have done. So at this point, and I'll leave these up here, and then when Jason went through the agenda, we've got 3 big chunks and a finite amount of time. So if the group spends a lot of time on one chunk of the agenda, that means there is less time for other pieces of the agenda. So this goes to that kind of manage your airtime piece, and let's try and prioritize the places that we want to engage each other and hear what everyone's thinking. So at this point, I want to have Wendy Willis come up, and in your packets there are some survey results. And so pull those out. The print font on some of them is small.
Don't look at me, I got my glasses.
And then the other part is Wendy is also a PPS parent, and there are some performances tonight that her kids are in, so she needs to leave at 6:25. So, Wendy.
Thank you, thanks. So, thanks for having me, and also thanks for being patient with this kind of rolling process of, ordinarily in a process you get a very shiny report that pulls out all the relevant data, but in this case, because of the timeline, we're sort of rolling the report out in response to what you need as you go. So that's, and there will be a shiny report, but it's it's probably a few weeks down the road. So I'm going to talk to you about what you have, highlight a few things, and then I'll answer questions. So what you have in your packet is a little report that has the weighted and unweighted answers to three forced choice questions having to do with boundary review. And those are the questions about middle school and K through 8, about the timeline for rolling out any boundary review, any boundary changes, and then a question about what the preferred strategies toward increasing equity in offerings are. So those are the three questions you have before you. You have two kind of separate documents. The one that looks more like a report, page 1 and 2, that just has the big data chunks, which is very similar to what you had last week, except for the fact that it has the weighted and the unweighted numbers. And what the difference between the weighted and the unweighted numbers is, there was not a demographically perfect sample, right? Obviously, when you do a kind of all-comers event where you just invite people to come and you don't create a demographic group and just let those people participate, you don't get a perfect sample. So the strategy that people are using nationally, the standard is that you weight to make it demographically representative. And so you'll see the weighted and the unweighted results. The headline for that is there's not very much difference. And so that's and that tells you a lot. And when we get into the details, which are the crosstabs, which you'll see in there's the pages that go behind, the 6 pages that go behind with the tiny little light print. You'll kind of see why there's not very much difference between the weighted and the unweighted results. There's a couple things that I want to point out. One is that it looks from the report like there's very little Native American or Pacific Islander participation, negligible amount. That's actually not true. Here's the situation: is the largest group when it's put in census tract terms is multiracial, which is 294 people. That's the largest group after white. And because of that, particularly Native Americans get swept up into that multiracial group. It's really important to us to try to unravel that. But it's not something that we could do in a couple hours' time this afternoon to sort of to pull that out. But it's not because there aren't people who didn't identify as Pacific Islander or Native American, but it's because they identified as one of those two racial groups and something else. And when that happened, then they got swept up into either, which is multiracial. So that sort of explains why that looks like there's very little representation of Native Americans. Now let's look at the crosstabs together for 1 second. So that's pages, you'll see it's pages 1 through 6. And what they provide to you, I think, is what you asked for last week, which is the answers to these forced choice questions, and you'll see, like, for example, on page 1, this is about question 3, and it has the question at the top, yes.
So mine just has every other page.
It does?
I have every odd numbered page.
Well, there was just a 1 line on the back, and I thought you said you wanted it copied into 4 pages, so I can run down and I would be happy to do it. It was just 1 little line on the back. Because I didn't understand what you were saying.
This is just the way the
pages
pages
The email you said it was just 2, 4, 6.
About 1, 3, 5, 6, 9, 10 total pages.
There's page 11.
6 pages. Do you have 6 pages of writing?
So we can talk about page 1, and then by the time we get to page 2, we'll have it. Thank you very much for doing that. Okay, so just to look at it, so it's question 3 at the top, you'll see, and then you'll see it broken down by totals, which reflects what you have on that report page. And then it has it by racial, there's a racial breakdown, and you'll see the columns, and then Title I, and then the clusters. So that's sort of how everything's laid out, and you can see how people answered question 3 based on those breakdowns. So this is the question that is that there's an ongoing conversation about middle schools in the district, and middle schools versus K-8 for middle grades, and how do people fall on that question. As you saw last week, that 71% of people said they thought it was more important when forced to choose between the two They thought it was more important to have a robust full-service middle school, essentially. And if you look at the breakdown, I know that you wanted to look at the breakdown, particularly across racial groups. It is extremely consistent. And that's why you don't have, when you look at weighted and unweighted, there's really no difference. It's because it's very consistent. You'll see 77% of African Americans, 76% of Asians, and the one place you'll see a little, it goes down a little bit, where Hispanic families will say 59% prefer, 59 to 41 middle school to K-8, but still a majority. And I think there's a smaller preference in one of the things that might be interesting to you is a slight less of a preference in Jefferson and Grant. So that's question 3. It gives you a pretty clear picture of where folks are on that. Does anybody have any questions about that question?
What do the letters mean next to the numbers?
The letters next to the numbers. I have no idea. I don't know what those letters mean.
No P and no PQ?
Yeah, right, yeah. I don't know what they mean. One thing I did want to point out to you, oh, you don't have page 2, so I will go on. I will point something out on page 2 when you get it. Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's not that, when you get it, it's not a big deal, but it's just something to notice. And that is, when you look at who the person is, parents of PPS students.
We have that page.
Oh, you do?
It's just numbered page
It just
3.
says page 3.
We have
but
6 pages.
We have, yeah.
Oh, mine says page 2. But anyway, so you see the page where it says 32% parents of PPS students prefer K-8s for middle grades, 68% prefer.
Yeah, we have that.
Okay,
Yeah.
prefer traditional middle schools, and so that's a slightly lower majority in your current PPS families. So does anyone want to talk about question 3, or should we press on?
I think it's also interesting.
So question 6, this is the question about boundary changes being made over time so that communities stay together is one choice. The other choice is it happens as soon as possible so that equitable outcomes happen quickly. And that's essentially the trade-off. You'll see that overall 55% say they prefer faster action, 45% says they prefer prefer to roll out over time. So it's a majority still, but not as large a majority. The interesting things there's a couple interesting things to look at here. One is that there's a much larger majority of African American families and Hispanic families who prefer the faster movement. So it's still a majority, but it's a bigger majority. This is the one place where there's a racial or ethnic group that actually diverges from the whole, and that is, you'll notice the 1, 2, third column over, the majority flips, and Asian families say that they actually would prefer slower movement over faster movement. The thing I will not by much. The thing I will point out to you that is interesting, that might tell you something about that number, is the clusters where there's a preference for slower movement are Cleveland, Lincoln, and Grant. So those are the clusters. Those are the clusters where there's preference for slower movement. So that may give you some information about how to cross-tabulate that in your own head. One thing that I thought was sort of interesting about this is if you look at page, what I guess is, I don't know what number it is for you, it's page 4 for me, the next number, is if you look at current parents of current PPS students, it's split down the middle, 50-50.
Oh, interesting.
So when that slight majority disappears when you get to current parents. Now that, what that means is no matter what the timeline is, somebody's going to yell. I mean, that's the bottom line, because people are there's just no clear majority there. So the third column on that next page.
Teachers and staff.
So let's move on to the next question. So, and this is question 16, which was the question about the way in which the preferred strategy for improving equity of offerings in schools. And the two, in my head, I call them moving money or moving kids. And so it's really, the first strategy is about moving students around so that the money follows the students. The second strategy is about moving money around regardless of how many kids are in school in order to make sure that offerings are equitable without it all being about enrollment. So those are the kind of the two options that people are given. There's a clear majority across all racial and ethnic groups for moving money rather than moving kids. There's a strong majority among African Americans that moving money is the preferred strategy. So just, and then, I find this really interesting, and I don't know what to make of this one, but the Title I schools are split down the middle. There's no majority, 50-50, about whether moving money or moving kids is the preferred strategy. And then the only cluster where there was a reversal of that majority was Madison. So Madison cluster preferred moving kids to moving money. So that's kind of where we are right now. I mean, what I would say to you, just as an observer of this, is that's a tremendous amount of agreement. Like, this is an amount of agreement that, you know, could have gone another way. And so, as I look at it, I think that's a lot of agreement about these three questions. And forced choice questions are hard, and people get grumpy about them. But you know, when you get down, when people are asked to really make a choice, you ended up with a lot of agreement, really. So, questions, thoughts, confusions?
Okay.
I have one minor, which is when you were talking about the individuals who identified as multiracial.
Yeah.
What would be a timeline for you when you're able to actually unpack that? I would be curious to see how other communities fit in that section and how that influences the breakdown and reporting of different communities.
I will find that out for you, Jason. And it may be that there's, speaking of forced choices, it may be that the question is, would you rather have that first, or would you rather have the racial and ethnic breakdowns on some of the other questions first? And so I think that's the, yeah, so I don't, it's because we're not doing the analysis, I go back and ask our partner about that. I mean, we're gonna unpack it just so that we know the numbers. Right. But then once we have the numbers, then we'll provide some additional data. I mean, what I will tell you is, with this level of agreement, when you've got a, when you have a weighted and unweighted sample, that it would be a shock on these three questions if you had a huge outlier. Because there just doesn't seem to be a big outlier anywhere. But that doesn't mean it's not possible, it's just unlikely.
So you said there's a lot of agreement. I think you're meaning across groups, but I would say that there's also a lot of, like a 44-56 split is not a lot of agreement. It's people equally have the opposite opinion. So, I mean, I don't know, is that pretty common? Like, I know when people vote for president, it's like pretty split, right? Pretty close. Is it usually pretty close?
No, I mean, it just depends on the question.
It varies on the question.
It really depends on the question.
So, how do we get advice on how to gauge? I mean, the first question obviously is pretty clear. I'm good in my mind saying that's pretty clear. But the other ones, how do we know? Do we just say there's a 10-point split, so we go with the majority, or do we?
That's your decision-making process.
And I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's your decision. You know, you kind of now have some information, and now it's your process to decide what you want to do with that. And people were told as they took this, you know, as they went through this process, either in person or on paper or online, that this was about advising your work, that this wasn't a vote, like it's not a referendum. Right. They don't get to pick. Right. It's advising you all to make the best decision you can make.
What's the margin of error?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, it's not a statistically valid survey, because it was an all-comer survey. And so so margin of error kind of doesn't apply in the same way that it does and when you go out and say, this is demographically representative of the United States.
Even of the weighted sample?
Yeah, I mean, there will be a margin of error, and I'll get it to you, but I would, take it with a grain of salt. Yeah, John.
Yeah, it will be smaller though than what you would get in a typical phone survey.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
phone survey, you're going to get between 400 and 600. So here you've got over 4,000. So the margin of error will be much smaller than what
That's
you
right.
in a poll that's publicized during an election or something. So, and the results we'll look at in all of these things, because the district's going to look at this for other things as well, will be the weighted. Because Davis-Hibitz has used their weighting tools to get it to match up the overall demographics of the community. So, I want to send around to everybody. So Pew Charitable Trust actually put out a brand new study this week that shows that public opinion research is actually for the first time tipping now to more surveys being done on the internet and being accurate than the phone survey system, because they're able to reach a more demographically representative sample now as so many people move off of answering phones or having home phones and being willing to participate on the internet. I'll send it around to the committee. I think you'll find it to be really fascinating.
And because this was a mixed model, it's even more representative, because it was both paper and online. Yeah, it's fully phone capable.
It's more for you.
Yeah.
So I just did a quick check. The thing, you guys had all the information that Wendy and I did. It printed out with different page numbers for Janet. So just to be clear, you had all the numbers that we had on all the pages.
Can I just ask another sampling question? So I know, it's actually more for John. You did a lot of outreach for the Successful School Survey, and then this was tagged onto that. And you did you do as much outreach for the second survey as well?
Oh yeah, we had the same staff. We engaged multiple community
The same way,
partners.
because it seemed pretty thorough. And then, so how many people tagged through, but did you get coming from the first survey?
That's a good question.
The first day, we had 1,000 people participate. So that we know that is people who've taken the first one. And then each time we sort of reminded that pool, we would get a couple hundred. So you can't tell exactly, but we know at least the first day. And having 1,000 people participate in the first day is amazing, right? That's an incredible thing.
So how many surveys were answered in the first?
We were able to get about 6,300 of the successful schools, and then 4,100 this one. So
And we definitely did hear a little confusion at the beginning about whether they're the same, and then a little bit of
survey.
I'm tired of doing this. Talk to me next year, kind of.
And I talked to people who had real problem with Oregon kitchen table logging in.
I did. You did. You've come. Gave up. Yeah, you've come. Yeah.
Well,
Okay. I observe Superintendent Smith is here. Yes. Come on up. This is our next piece of the agenda, and
And I'm escaped from an event downstairs where I'm handing out certificates shortly, so I'm going to take you through what I know to take you through.
you can keep that up.
It's really fragrant. I'm just going to say, it smells really great. And I should have come up and called you down for the lion dance because it was fabulous. It was really great. Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to say thank you for the work that you've been doing, and I'm really excited to come in the not too distant future where you're briefing me on what it is you're going to brief the board. So, and I know that you had a conversation last meeting that was angst about the grade configuration. So I hope that what I say tonight ends up being informational for you, but it's not like a definitive, this is the thing. I'm going to tell you where the factors that we know and what we're holding on to, and that what you guys do as part of the boundary framework needs to hold regardless of grade configuration, and not have that be the definer of what you're doing with the boundary framework. So
But what we know and what we're looking at and considering as we're looking at grade configuration, overall driver of strong educational program in every school. So we've got to have a number of kids that support that. We're looking at the portfolio of our buildings and what they will actually hold, because we are not looking at, I mean, we're going to move through the portfolio at a pace that isn't like, okay, now we get to go rebuild to a different size immediately. So we've got some constraints that are about the size of our building, and we're actually doing a pretty detailed analysis of what that actually means in terms of the programs we're trying to run in them. We have, we're on the trail of doing our early learning programs as regional early learning centers, as opposed to trying to do pre-K in our building. So all of these have an impact of what actually fits in a building, which is why I'm going to tell you all the things that are the elements. So we're doing the regional, and partly this is about the size of our buildings, so we don't have the ability to do big pre-K and still hold, you know, the rest of the grade levels, nor will we be able to afford to be able to do that, because there was a big debate early on about, okay, this is how we build relationships with our families. We want them located in at every site, and we can't afford to do that. So what we have started to do is do regional hubs that are in proximity but that hold early learning, 0 pre-K, and now at some point K, and we've got those in various parts of the city, but we'll continue to do that model for our pre-K. We are looking at, we've got dual language immersion programs in a number of schools, and we intend to continue to build those in the system. So that's another factor where it requires a different kind of classroom classroom availability in order to actually do those. But we know we both want to support the ones we have, as well as leave room for expansion of those. We know we have a limited number of buildings that will actually support a full K through 8 with enough at the middle grades to support a robot. This has been the tension since we went to the pre-K 8, and everybody knows this. The places where people are happy with their pre-K 8 is really where you've got enough students at the middle grades to offer a robust program, and then you've got pretty high levels of satisfaction. Places where you don't have that, a lot of dissatisfaction. So although that's also not a no-brainer either, you've got people who just like that because of the fewer transitions, and your kids get to be in the same school. But what we're looking at is where do we have the buildings that could actually house a K-8? And I'm believing that where we're going to land is probably closer to that the predominant configuration will be K-5 middle school, but that we'll still have some K-8s that probably end up being ones that are opt-in kind of K-8s. So just to say, I don't think it'll be it's not going to be as satisfying. We are like a linear, symmetrical. This is this, you know, it will still be looking at what our buildings will accommodate and figuring out. But I think by looking at what we've got so far and by building capacity, it's probably going to be more. And while we're in growth mode. So the other big factor here, you guys, is the moment that the K-8 configuration happened was in a declining enrollment moment and a way reduced resource moment, and it happened too quickly without planning, and period. I'm not going to go further down that trail except to say we're in a wholly different territory now because we're looking at another 5,000 kids in the next decade. So we're now planning for growth. So the K-5 middle school as the primary with some K-8s where they fit is probably. The other factors I would say in here is looking at doing inclusion models for special ed, for ELL, and having space in buildings for our partners that are wraparound service partners, which is again space consideration. So what we're really saying, what do we need in a building? Now this one I'm just being very cautious about saying just because, but I will say it because it's another factor, is I'm also imagining that as we're rebuilding our high schools, by the time we are done, Marshall, which we're using as a swing space now, our demographic growth will probably have us back to the point that we reopen Marshall. So when you're thinking about, but I'm just going to say, this is the whole thing in an urban district where you are going to be inflatable, deflatable as people raise their kids and stay in their homes, and then houses turn over, and now you've got young kids again, and you have demographic bubbles that move through, and we need to do, so Marshall was the expansion site 50 years ago. We then tucked back in. It'll be the one where we go back out again. So you're gonna be thinking of a framework that allows us to matter-of-factly do the boundary shifts that we need to do as we do that. So like just in terms of what are the complexities we're trying to consider, these are the ones that we're looking at and doing scenario building. But what you guys do with a boundary framework needs to be something that holds its integrity regardless of all this, because this is the stuff that will keep moving as we have to be inflatable, deflatable to have quality programs to meet the needs of all of our kids. So those are the ones that I can think to put out in front of you at this moment. And we are actively building scenarios right now and doing all the factors that I'm talking to you about, running those through, what it actually looks like and what we can, oh, the other factor, and you know this from, is our focus options. We're doing a review of the focus options, which includes both what's their purpose and who are they serving, but also where are they located. And we will have, just by change, some of the places where focus options are currently located, that we may need those buildings to offer a neighborhood program because of what our demographic shifts are, and where we will be looking at just where are they located and how they meet the needs of our kids across the whole system. So that's another factor in there, and I'm trying to think if there are other ones. Those are the ones that are in my head right now. But so complex, but also I don't think any of that is new news as much as that's the complexity that has to be able to fit together as we're, and I'm going to say that doing the district-wide approach rather than the cluster by cluster adds an elegance to it as well as a different kind of complexity. So I'll just say that too. So I'm really looking forward to the wisdom that this group gives us about how to think about the boundaries in all of this, because probably our biggest need is to be able to be pretty matter-of-fact about that, as in a way that we haven't been able to be, as we're having to navigate some of these shifts. And again, growth mode rather than deplete mode, which is a really different environment to be in, but boy, are we planning for the growth. So, Sarah, you have anything else you would throw in there?
No, I think you did a great job.
Did I get anything? Okay. Anything else? No. Sean?
You good?
Okay. Okay. And I'm happy to come back and do more of this with you guys. As Jason, you got any more that you want to questions or anything?
If you have a few minutes, I want to make sure that, because this isn't, I'm thankful that the superintendent, you came and directly addressed this issue, because this has been a question that has come up multiple times. So the intent was to hopefully say, does what she say, is it sufficient enough that you all heard so that we can continue to work on the other things and the components that we've got on our plate? So I guess my question is, does anyone have any clarifying questions about, hey, just the timeline for this and how it interweaves with us? So I'll go Misha, then Jim.
I mean, probably the one, yes, right, which is timeline and rollout.
So the other one I would say, and it connects with you guys as well. So what we're doing some mapping right now, and part of what we're also doing is trying to map our major processes right now and how they align with each other. What I will say, this is not like, okay, tomorrow we're all of a sudden going to create a bunch of new middle schools. It is the, so I don't have like here's a timeline for you. What I will tell you we're trying to do is map, here's how the boundary stuff is happening, here's how our enrollment and transfer stuff is happening, here's how our bond work, how this maps out over time, here's where we imagine we would do a new middle school, and here would be the planning year, here would be the implementation, like we're trying to do mapping, but also how do these all line up with each other. We're at the fat section of bond implementation right now, where we just did the, whatever, we're doing 28 buildings. This summer, we've got 2 high schools we just broke ground on. We're doing the master planning, launch on grant. And then we've got Fabian in the wings. We've got a bunch of that is happening, and we're gonna be doing the work, as if all goes as planned, on the high schools for the next little stretch. So that what we're doing with the K-8s, we're still doing in that context. So we're not like, okay, now imagine a bunch of K-8s and we get to go build them. We don't. I'm not going to preclude that as we're moving through this, there may be opportunities to then say, here in the future, as this area is growing, we have a different configuration that becomes one that makes sense in that context. But we're right now working with the buildings that we have, and without, you know, and our capital resources really going into the stuff we already know about. So that's not going to come in as a magic new factor here. But we won't do okay, tomorrow we try and do something. That's really the thing that people don't want, is that we do claim it, try and do it, and we haven't. If we do new middle schools, we've got to design and have quality middle school programming that we've really, you know, putting people through a process to build it.
Are there other places where, you know, sort of like what happened with Rickler, where there was a school and a middle school space? I'm assuming that's one of the.
Wait, say that again?
factors. Sort of like what happened with Rickler in Beaumont, where there was a middle school space and a K-8 that needed to be reconfigured.
We've had a bunch of that stuff. We've had a bunch of
Yeah.
hodgepodge as we're trying to, so like the solutions have been ones that have been, again, contained within individual clusters or responding to, you know, immediate. We've got something that's an immediate, and what we're trying to do is really do the growth plan over time, so, yeah.
I want to make sure you don't.
I know, I guess I have to go downstairs and give certificates to kids, so I
Student-centered,
student-centered, I know. Let me do 2 more questions and then I'm gonna head down.
Good.
Kim and Michelle, and
Good.
I just, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely focused on the timeline. What does this look like? How is it going to be rolled out? I do appreciate the fact that you said that it may just be, and I may be reading between the lines, but that I think however you roll it out, it needs to be transparent to people. Don't ask their opinion if it doesn't really matter.
So here's what I'll tell you, the survey that we just got back too, and I'm really interested in seeing when we do the weighting of the data, who is responding in what way. And I will tell you, when we went into the Jefferson enrollment balancing conversation, I believe we were gonna end up with a middle school, because what I had been hearing like loudly was the desire for a middle school in the Jefferson cluster. However, once we got going in the conversation, it is we want both and. Like, we want our K-8s, we love our K-8s, and we want a middle school option. So the other factor in here is, this is also an ecology of the whole conversation, so it's not that you get to build all the choices regardless of who comes and fund them all. You know that we don't get to do that. So part of the whole balancing act here is both listening to what people want and feel attached to, and we now have more people attached to the K-8s than we did previously, because now some people love them, depending on your experience, and some people are like, I don't get the depth of offering or the breadth of offering I want. But that's not like a no-brainer, and we did not end up with a slam dunk something at the end of as you know, at the end of that conversation.
No, definitely.
So,
but I'm really, to be honest with you, you telling me all this, it's great, but it actually makes me more anxious about our timeline for this committee.
what would help you? If I could tell you,
a
here's-
timeline.
Yeah, and
A plan.
I'm going to tell you, there's, you want that and you don't want that, because you also want to help shape it. So like, I'm just going to, I mean, I think this is, like, the stuff I'm telling you is the stuff that are the ingredients driving it right now, which are the things we know that we're trying to have contained within our system. And I think the biggest thing I'm saying to you is I do imagine the primary configuration being K-5 and middle. That's what our buildings have for our current kind of programming as the primary. I do imagine it will still have some number of K-8s. I don't know how many, but it'll be driven a lot by where do we have buildings that are large enough to house them and have enough programming. So we're on that path. I don't imagine an overnight conversion and having it all just be like, now we're just doing it all. I imagine, you know, we're going to be pretty methodical about how we're rolling out whatever changes we do.
Which I appreciate. Yeah, it does.
So, and I'm sorry, I can't say more than that, but that's what I know. I'm being very transparent with you about what do I know at this moment. That's what I know at this moment. So, and I get the frustration of that. I have it too. But you also wouldn't want me to be jumping and telling you something before we're really there, and we're not really there. So that's where we are.
Michelle, last question before.
Yeah, do one more, and then I really have to go to
Yeah,
kids.
and it's not related to that, so that's good. At the very beginning, when we first started meeting, we went briefly over some really basic facilities numbers, and I got stuck back then, and I'm still stuck on understanding the capacity and the utilization calculations, and I guess this is a request that maybe once you've done this review, that we really get
I
back
can walk you through it.
to that more, because I'm trying to figure out how we're going to incorporate the equity into that and how we wrap in the programming pieces and the special ed pieces and the other pieces of equity into the hard numbers of utilization and capacity. And so I really, as just for me personally, I really want to get back to that, because I think we need that to make sure that we're doing the equity thing in our framework.
Good. And
So whenever you're ready.
Yeah, well, and we're in the process of doing, so these guys are doing some of that mapping right now. And it's a more complex mapping, I think, than we've done previously in terms of really looking at a bunch of the dimensions of programming that I just said, as opposed to just numbers of classrooms and, you know, what we're trying to do. We're really doing, like, again, DLI requires something, our dual language immersion requires something really different in terms of what you need in classrooms or wraparound services. Actually, and I mean, a number of the factors I just mentioned give more complexity to the picture. So.
The other add-on I'm just going to say is I'm just curious if we're ever going to talk about class size, because it really doesn't come up very much. And I just, for me as a parent, and just it's something I know other parents are twigged on, and I just wonder if you could give us some information on why we wouldn't or how we would incorporate that, because it's very important for facility use, right?
It is. It's a huge dimension. It's a huge dimension impacted by funding.
I know.
It's one we've actually made great improvement on in the last, you know, couple budget cycles. And I will say, I think another caution in here is for us not to to think in terms of optimal as opposed to where our budget takes us right now as we're planning, so that we don't, so that we're planning for optimal scenarios rather than, you know, scraping scenarios. How's that? In terms of with the idea that we want to end up with smaller class sizes. So, okay, you guys, I'm going to take off and go see kids, but thank you for inviting me, and I am coming back in the not too distant future, I believe, to hear from you. So I look forward to that. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So at this point, we're doing pretty well on time.
Hey, Jim. Can I just?
Yeah, John.
So a couple things I can say because I'm staff working on stuff that the superintendent has got too much to do to get in the middle. So in terms of the stuff you're talking about, when we get to the technical work that we're doing as a staff after you're done with your framework, I think the one big takeaway I hope you got is that very much what Joe Zender was saying last session, the biggest need that the superintendent has is a framework, a values-based framework that will work for any school configuration. This team here, Sarah and Sean, are leading that technical work on doing the analysis of the capacity of our buildings. That will be part of when we're doing the technical work that comes back to you. You will see all of that, okay? We have one thing that's really, really valuable that we didn't have before, which is the ed spec that was done on Fabian K-8. So we are rebuilding one brand new, fully modern K-8. And so the ed spec is a clear definition of what does it take in terms of a building's capacity to have a fully enrolled K-8. It's not something we had before because the bond brought that to us. So it allows them to take that and then do a today analysis on what is the actual capacity of our current elementary and middle school buildings. We couldn't do that before. Then you add in all the services that Carol talked about and all the additional programs that we know are working, like dual language immersion. They can add that into the capacity model, okay?
Okay, Sheila, question.
So my concern about this is that, my question is, will we have an answer on grade configuration before I mean, it sounds to me like we're not actually ever gonna set boundaries, because if we change them and then they change the grade configuration, they'll change again. So.
Maybe. I'm with you.
It's an ongoing process, I think.
So, it just sounds like we're not gonna get an answer.
How much more fluid work around boundaries? And historically, we don't change boundaries, and we really do need to, probably more than we currently do. Actually, definitely more than we do. So I think we need to take whatever framework, the framework is an important piece, and that's not going to be affected by the boundaries at all. I mean, that's what we use to set the boundaries against that.
But only if the framework is sufficiently specific to really guide the boundary setting, rather than so vague that it doesn't really say that much.
I think I think what has come up so far is pretty good.
So, Sasha, you had your hand up right when she was.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay,
Okay.
Scott, and then.
Well, to me, what it's saying is that when we, after we establish the framework and staff comes up with something, some options to us, they're gonna assume that every school continues to have its current configuration. And so we will redraw boundaries
With the
based on
current,
that.
yeah.
And then at points in the future, there is going to be, maybe one at a time, I don't know, we'll say, hey, this is where we really need to reconfigure. And that'll affect a relatively small circle of schools that's saying, okay, you're gonna be in the middle, you guys are going back to K-5. And so there'll be a boundary shake up here, and maybe a year or two later, a boundary shake up there, like that. But everything else will be set. I don't know that, that's assuming that you can do that without reverberations through the system.
And there are other things, there are program changes that can affect that. There's a lot of different stuff that can affect how many students you can have in a school and what your boundaries are.
Well, the DLI
That's
thing
why
is
it's
going to be
fluid.
ongoing because
What?
there's a lottery probably for some of those, and that's going
For me, one of the kind of key points here is not static. It can't be static, it's not going to be static. And if it's static, we could say X, Y, Z, line it up, bang. What happens is kids move, populations change. We've seen it even in my few years here. We've seen some neighborhoods dramatically grow and others dramatically shrink. We have one school that lost more than 100 kids between last year and this year. And so I think this for me has been a big challenge too. How do you let go of the idea that it will be fixed? Because it won't be fixed. It's going to change. And the question is, how do you manage that change intelligently and at a pace that works so that you're not, haphazardly, flopping around, but that you have a thoughtful thing. And I think in my view, the framework is here to help us when we come to a situation say, these are the values, these are the things that we're prioritizing, and we make the best decision we can make based on the scenario at that moment in that space.
And the levers, all the different levers.
All the levers, right.
Boundaries is only one.
And I think we really need to get to the place where we're really concretely defining those levers. So, and I think we have started. So our core program, as we know today, the district's core program is this. Dual language immersion, we've talked about, it has different classroom requirements, but we haven't really heard what those are. So, it impacts space this wise, and then so we can start looking at those different levers and that the framework pieces, and then we can start building some of those scenarios. They're going to give us information. The team's going to give us information. But I think we need to start building with some scenarios, much in the way that Carol said that they're building scenarios. To just start talking about real things and see what would that mean. And I think one piece of the values that came out for me that maybe isn't enough values piece, maybe kind of implicitly, was and that there's some split on is time to roll out. I think we talked about transparency, but will we give families enough time to get used to an idea of a boundary change? What is an optimal time? What is a realistic time given the other pressures? And I think maybe we need to talk some about that.
And I think several of the comments here highlighted to me the importance of this group identifying key values that that you can transmit to the superintendent and others that can hopefully guide regardless of the particular circumstances. And that's fairly easy to say, it's probably harder to do. And that's part of what the next agenda item is all about, is to be zeroing in on these values that we think can serve the district and the community in a variety of circumstances. Kim?
I'm feeling a little bit of what Alice was talking about as far as we haven't done this before. We've never done this before. We don't know what people's capacity is as far as how long. And what I'm afraid of is that we do a boundary change, and then the conversions of whatever they are happen, and we do more disruption. I don't want the work that we do to be degraded in that. You know what I mean? Because are people going to tie those together? Because I'm just, it's a worry of mine. I can't envision what it's gonna look like that people are going to be comfortable, because I'm also of the opinion that whatever we do needs to be done. We don't need to talk it to death. I mean, it comes to a point where things need to be done, let's just do it. But if we're talking do it now and then do it a year later and then do it 2 years later, that doesn't sound good to me. So I don't know if I'm the only one with that concern, but it worries me a lot.
It's a valid concern, and something, we may have said it at some of the early meetings. This group hasn't been together and done this work before. The district hasn't had a group to do this work before. The community's not interacted in a process like this before. So in a very real way, you're pioneering, and pioneering is, you know, grand and glorious sometimes, and other times it's uncomfortable and risky and scary. So, I think you're right on that you want to have good results that are implemented well, and that's that, you know, assume noble intent and goodwill, and then make sure we're transparent about things, right? So, I want to go.
I'll be really fast.
One comment before. One of the key things we need out of tonight is for the subcommittee to get some feedback from all of you about, are we on the right course with the context and the values and desired outcomes. So the more time we spend on this, the less time we're able to spend on that. Michelle.
Just to what Kim was saying, which it might be helpful reminder or to keep in our minds, that as we get a little more detail into the values framework, I'm hoping we get to the point where we can talk about when they start to conflict. Because to me, that means we've got, if they all the values are so fundamental that we all agree on them, then I don't think we've got a lot of depth there. And I think that one sign of having some depth in our values will be when we get to have to make some difficult choices.
Yeah,
so
forced choices.
You want, yeah.
I think you're wrong on that.
So what you were saying reminded me of the public comment that at some point the need to keep changing things is going to potentially conflict with how I interpret her thing, her sense of belonging in a community. And if the community is being asked to adjust regularly, then that's going to be a conflict. So I think whenever we're talking about things, if we can phrase it in terms of, well, I like this, but it kind of conflicts with that, and it makes me, you know, where are we? Because we're going to have to be somewhere on tolerances. So, I don't know.
So let's shift to Jason. I do. I don't know what his range is.
We'll find out in a couple seconds. So really quick, first is, I just wanted to say, I was very appreciative that you all really spoke candidly last week, which is why we tried to get some responses to those questions as fast as we did. So what I will say is two things. One is, if you have any kind of continued lingering questions about this issue, I would really appreciate it if you write it on the exit slip tonight so that I can use that to send back to staff so that we keep this dialogue going, because I don't want this to be just the one time we talk about it. And to Michelle's point on some of the facilities questions, folks that are trying to do the different scenarios, what have you, they've been attending the meetings in the back and are hearing the questions, so I would suspect that when they come back with a big report down the road, a lot of those questions are going to hopefully be answered. So
they're working on it.
They're working on it. So I just want to open that. Third is, I just wanted to acknowledge as we go into the values discussion tonight, I think Kim's big point is, and one of the things that I've been appreciative about this group is that we all have a different kind of a history with Portland Public. We've seen the good and we've experienced the not so good, and I think, and the ugly. And I think one of the things that we'll come to that is to just, as a process that we're trying to really build for the first time, that we know what the bad feels like and how different communities have experienced it, and we're all really thoughtful about trying to ensure that whatever we formally create for the first time doesn't repeat whatever's happened historically. So what I hope as part of the discussion tonight is the first step in terms of how we define the values that ensure that whatever process that we create or recommend in the district does more of the good and doesn't repeat the bad. So what I would really be helpful for the members tonight is, throughout the discussions, to really think about the language that we have spent, I would honestly say, about 3 to 4 meetings about. Have we hit it accurately? Are there things that we're missing, or have there been things that were incorporated in past drafts that you think are essential that should be included, and at what point? So tonight is for us to have the discussion of how are we close to getting the values framework discussion at least locked for this component, and how do we improve on it where there are potential gaps. So I appreciate the folks that have emailed me potential comments or things to change, and so I want to keep that going over the course of tonight. So, oh, that's a good one. Okay. All right, so the first thing I did want to say is there were two things you should have out. One is the original values version, which is 1A, that incorporates all of the original draft plus the comments that you all submitted, plus the PowerPoint, which is version 2. So one of the big things that came out of the discussion from last week was that while the list of values was comprehensive, that there was kind of a lack of clarity around which items in fact were value statements. And there are some items that were potential statements about process, and some things that were potentially about outcomes for not only just a boundary change process, but for in the future, however the district chooses to use the levers it has to manage enrollment balancing, that it uses those values to say, here's what we're trying to ultimately achieve. And so the PowerPoint that you have tonight is framed in that way in 3 categories. First is the context, kind of the history of what led us to this point and the different conditions. Part 2 is the values that we think are, based on what everyone has said tonight, is the core values that we think should be driving current and future boundary change processes. And part 3 is the outcome. So in the end, what every boundary change process should achieve, not just now, but in future years. So the framework is based on those 3 categories that a number of folks gave some version of in terms of their comments for last week. So how we'll walk through this tonight is, for the context, I'll just read through the bullet points and then have folks at the end of it just tell us right off the bat, are you a red, yellow, and green? So green is as a package for at least the context that you're good with it, good with the language as proposed. Yellow is you have some clarifying questions, but you can support the general intent of where we're headed. And red would mean one of 2 things. Red means either you disagree with the language as it's currently written in the PowerPoint, or, and this is why we have versions 1A and 2, is if you think there's some language in the first version that we omitted in version 2 that should be put in the updated draft. So as you're listening to the things that I'll cover tonight, so be thinking about that would really help Pamela, Joe, and myself and others to how to really move this version from tonight and then the next version you see next week or in the next couple of days. Okay?
We don't have enough of these.
Oh,
yeah.
We don't have enough.
So we need.
Janet, do we have more?
there's some business stuff in there.
Oh,
Scott forwarded her.
we're good. I don't have one.
Yeah, did Scott have 2 at some point?
There's a set right in front of that
That's
folder.
Sasha's.
Okay, here's another one. Janet Scott Moore. Okay, everyone has red, yellow, green.
Okay. So first up is context. First, history. Institutional racism in public policy has contributed to neighborhood segregation and the achievement gap. And by the way, if you have, also if you're going to be yellow, that would be the section where you have grammatical changes for us. Someone politely said that there are a number of grammar changes, so thanks for telling me that. Part 2 under history. Portland Public Schools has managed enrollment changes differently depending on the circumstances and community, leading to mistrust. Current and future external environment. Portland population and district enrollment is projected to grow significantly in the next 10 years. Gentrification is impacting the city and specifically neighborhoods that have traditionally been home to communities of color. And 50% of Portland Public Schools elementary, K-8, middle schools are currently either overcrowded or under-enrolled. Part 3, acknowledgement of the achievement gap. Portland Public Schools has a stated goal of, quote, every student succeeds regardless of race or class. In practice, however, long-standing significant disparities exist in student achievement. And part of an effort to mitigate those disparities long-term, the district has adopted a number of priorities and initiatives. 1, the milestones framework. 2, the superintendent's 3 priorities. And 3, the racial educational equity policy and the racial equity lens to guide efforts to address current inequality in the system. And part 5 is what we think is the purpose of boundaries, which is to right-size attendance boundaries are one component that ensure healthy enrollment at schools in order for students to access effective programs, enrichment, and support services. So I'll give everyone a minute to just think about that, and I'll call for cards. Okay, so I'll go in reverse order. So those who are reds.
And red means you disagree or language was not successfully incorporated into this draft from last draft.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
So let me just say, because there isn't a map from here to there, it's really hard to tell if something is left out without really spending more time kind of going through what we have done.
Does that, Scott, to try and address that, does that mean, do you think I should give folks at least maybe 5 minutes to read through both versions and then try and make some sense of it? Would that be helpful?
That means halfway through going back and forth between these two, we might find something that, wait, where did this go? Why isn't it or something? Just want to throw that out.
Another way to think about it, and I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong. Another way to think about it is if you had comments last week that you related to history and related to these 5 main things, and you're reading this now, and that flag pops up again in your head, well, that's an indication the group didn't hit it right. But if you had comments and suggested changes for some of these pieces last week, and you read this and you're feeling okay about it, that likely indicates the subcommittee did successfully address it.
So I'll press this question, what are we doing?
Yeah. All right. So let's call, I'm going to call for yellow cards and let's see. Anyone's got a yellow? 1.
So I counted 8 yellows.
Jim is going to be 9.
Maybe 9. Okay.
All right. And greens?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 greens.
Yeah, do 2 yellow actually.
Add you 2 yellows, so 10 yellows.
Okay. So Jim, for this section, why don't we, so those who were yellow, could you tell Jim what your clarifications, so if it was either a clarifying question or grammar changes, we'll go around and just have you report out to Jim what it was.
So let's start on arbitrarily on this side of the room. If you were yellow and you had a grammar change.
Mine was just a grammar change. I would have added an S to gap because it's not just the achievement gap. There are multiple gaps and multiple different ways of addressing it. I'll leave that one down. Let's see.
Okay.
have another yellow person, Alice?
So I have one that's not necessarily grounded, and it's, I guess, a clarifying question. Once we finish this, I'm presuming that it will be a dated document, and particularly with the district priorities and initiatives, because people going back and looking at it will want to have access to those other district priorities, so that we should have a link or something connecting so they can go back and see. I can see the wording we use. And then I just wondered on the achievement gap, I echo the gaps, and I see that that's a quote about every student succeeds regardless of race or class. And I'm just wondering about disabilities. Disabilities,
There's multiple gaps. We have disparity has an S on it. I mean, it's not yes, so that all by itself is already acknowledging what we're both saying here. There's not just, there's multiple areas.
Alice, a question of clarification, so that I can chapter in what you're saying. So I think that there's a tension here around, we have the racial equity policy that focuses on race, and then we've talked multiple times about addressing race and class and special ed and gender, and there's all of these categories, and I guess I think we need to make a decision that sort of in this, for this line item, which we as a committee would want to do. Because I just didn't know whether your intent was to broaden it that way, or whether it was not like.
I have no problem with calling out racial equity because of, in particular, because of the particular challenges in TPS historically. I think it should be called out. That doesn't mean that the other thing shouldn't be in there.
So I guess, so what you're proposing, there should be maybe an additional bullet that mentions, okay, sorry, that's why I wanted to ask a point of clarification, because then I can capture it.
They are all on the second slide. The more.
On the second
I
slide,
know.
Michelle.
That's okay.
But it's reassuring.
Okay, so next yellow card person.
First line should be have, not has.
Okay.
And on the quote, the period is sort of floating out there, should be, it's in the quote. Inside the quotation. Yes, our scholar here.
Thanks, student.
Thank you, student. And
Well done.
Question on 2.3, maybe numbering these would have been better, where it says about gentrification in communities of color. I'm clear on that for the African American community, Northeast Portland. Are there other communities of color that have traditionally been in a neighborhood that are being gentrified? And if there are, great. I don't know that.
My point was actually
Native Americans used to
similar but a different.
occupy a large portion of where we now live, and if you want to think globally.
I want to think about how we edit this document right now.
That was pretty much.
So Sheila.
So
It took me a second.
I don't mean to skip the line, but my comment relates to his, and I believe that gentrification not only affects the communities where people move from, but also the communities where they move to. And so I think that needs to be acknowledged, because a lot of the people in charge of schools change happens in both where people move from and where they move to, and in different ways.
Just to kind of answer that question, historically, see, the history is very narrow. You have two lines, and in compressing all of the history of this situation to two lines, you leave out multiple things where the answer could have been yes. For instance, if we just take Vestal, the area around Vestal Grade School used to be where we had a significant gypsy population, which no longer exists within the boundaries of Portland Public Schools, where I'm pretty sure it's shrunk outside of the city limits. There's lots of things that happen with various cultural groups. I just use that one because that's one I think everybody can sort of relate to. looking around here relative to the age of the group, because I'm old, really, and grew up in the Augusta area. So, the answer is yes, but it's, I think what creates the narrowness is the fact that we use the history that's 2 lines long and references.
So
I'm greening what Harriet just said.
So I just want to make a point of clarification that this was just, I think, an exercise to try to get things, like, is this the point? But it will ultimately be a document, a multi-page document that will have more detail than this PowerPoint. But if we, and kind of to Scott's point, if we gave you the whole document, then we'd have to ask you to sit here for a long time. So there will be a document that will have opportunity for everybody on the committee to review, and if we, hopefully we'll be able to expand, we will expand a lot of it, and then if we leave things out there, please fill them in for us. So we're trying to strike that.
I don't think you just want to write a history book.
No, right, exactly, like that's what you better.
We're calling you.
So Sheila,
And
to
just-
close this piece up.
Just to that point, is it necessary that we do the grammatical changes, given that this is a draft? I mean, it seems to me that rather than spending time on grammatical
That's fair.
things, that we could
That's fair.
focus on
So
the
green
parts.
cards to skip grammar changes tonight. Any yellow cards to skip grammar changes tonight? Any red cards to skip grammar changes? Okay, let's skip grammar changes. We were at Scott. Next person with the yellow card. Sasha, Pamela, Maxine, let's go to Hector.
Oh, I had a yellow. Sorry,
Michelle.
I thought that nobody else had yellow. Sorry. I'm gonna do
Michelle,
the
yellow
achievement
card.
gap. I just think needs to be, I would like to discuss expanding it to not just grammar, but including the, I get uncomfortable when we just talk about achievement as an end product, as if everybody had equal access and opportunity and they just didn't achieve. It freaks me out. So I'd like to add in before achievement, opportunity, access, and or achievement. I'll just hand this in, but how do other people feel about that? I'm sure you feel good about that.
Did you say you had it written down there?
You're like,
Yeah.
sure you feel
Perfect.
good about that.
Perfect.
Well, I don't know, maybe you don't.
I didn't understand.
I don't understand. Okay, so while he took my copy, the sentence reads, the sentence reads, in practice, however, long-standing, I would give her the comments, and significant disparities exist in opportunity, access, and or achievement among students. So that we're not just saying the system is perfect, but differences in achievement arise, that we're saying that there's systematic.
Okay, I
The
got
play
it.
Got it.
system
Okay.
level.
I see what
I get it.
Right?
I get the
Pamela
intent.
has to say access to what?
Yeah.
Access.
I get the
Well, okay, opportunity, I can change it some more.
So I'm looking at subcommittee members. Do you think you have
Yes.
what you need to
Pam,
do
I see-
better?
I see-
Because what I hear Michelle saying is that calling it the achievement gap puts the onus on the student.
That's what I'm saying.
As opposed to where it belongs on the system.
That's what I'm saying. So,
Right, and when you
however,
just-
word
and
it
when
Yeah.
you
how
limit
be
it by
like.
race, it puts it on students of color.
Yeah.
So that there's a whole different.
Yes,
Got it.
it does.
Right.
Got it.
Okay, so next yellow card, Secretary.
So yeah, my yellow card is actually related to several of the comments. So I'm part of the committee that's working on this, and I do think what we need to do, what Pamela said, we need to contextualize this better and fill out some of what we mean by some of what's up there. So I'm finding this really helpful to really reconstruct this, to make it more of a narrative and not just a bullet pointed thing. Not that we won't have bullet points, but really, I think we're missing some narrative here.
Terrific. Next yellow card person.
Yeah, so I would ask the subcommittee to look at bullet 2 again, because I agree with leading to mistrust, but the act of doing something different isn't, I mean, that's a kind of equity. Equity is not doing things the same. So I don't think necessarily doing things differently is led to mistrust. What led to mistrust was our lack of doing things equitably or considering that, and we, right?
I hear what you're saying, but
If you're
it's
trying to say, if
the
it's
white
trying
people.
to say that, I'm just.
I agree with you. I have a big question mark
I
under
just,
the whole
I know,
thing.
I think, I understand what it's trying to say, but I don't, if you're treating people differently because of the color of their skin, or that's wrong. If that's what we're saying, then let's just call that out like that.
I agree.
But that, how it's written doesn't lead me to that.
But we might have to do things differently to achieve equity.
That's right.
Exactly.
So we would violate that.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
Tony, can you
I'll
write one sentence and then
Yeah, I'll try.
email it to Pamela and
Yeah.
Jason?
And it can be grammatically correct.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, next yellow card person.
That's me. I'm
Pam.
No, she's not. So, yeah, agreeing with lots of the other things that have been said here. The ones that I kind of focused on are under the achievement gap piece. Excuse me, under district priority and initiatives. The milestones framework, yeah, is great. I mean, I know we're gonna bring it back now that we don't have to put up with the compacts through the OEIB. So we have that again, hooray. Back to our framework. But the superintendent's 3 priorities change with every
So we
year.
should spell the ones out that are current?
Well, I'm just not sure that that's, because those all are reflected in the milestones of what we're trying to achieve there, so her priorities depend on what the board sets for her. So I'm not sure if those, like I said, they change every time. And then I think another important piece under that has to do with budget, money, because unless we differentiate our resources, it doesn't, we can talk about it all the time. Unless we really put money behind what we're saying we believe in, then we don't do it. So I think we need to include something about differentiated resources under our priorities and initiatives.
I agree.
Cool.
I actually think that there's other things that should be added in there.
And then Hector, you'd have to help me with this one, because the last one, racial educational equity policy and racial equity lens guides efforts to address current inequality in the system. That doesn't sound quite right to me, and I just can't quite figure out what.
So I think that's one of the things that we need to reword and recontextualize.
The inequality thing doesn't fit for me, but, I mean, I think I understand what it's trying to say, it's just not clear to me.
Yeah, I think we can do that.
Terrific. So
And
next
then-
yellow, oh, I'm sorry. I thought
And
you
then the
were-
one
sorry.
under current and future external environment on gentrification, I was just looking at that more like as being much more active rather than passive. So, and maybe that's grammar, but gentrification impacts the city and specifically neighborhoods that have traditionally been home communities of color. So-
Okay. Next yellow card person.
First of all, I agree with almost everything that's been said so far, which feels good that we're all on the same page. But as far as to your question of where do we draw the line on every student succeeds regardless of race or class or disability or whatever, I think that we need to figure out a way to word that in a way that does include, there's a lot of invisible, you know, I have a gender nonconforming son. There's a lot of kids out there that probably don't even know that they are. And so, and you can't tell me that that doesn't impact their achievement. So, I don't know where we draw the line, but how can we include every kid that has a hurdle? Or something that is making it not, race being obviously the first, because we recognize, but how do we balance?
So let me just ask you, what I think I heard earlier is if we had one bullet, and again, these are going to be paragraphs, one paragraph that specifically focuses on race, and one paragraph
or the other
that addresses this idea that we need to serve all students regardless of whatever their issues are, PPS's job is to provide an excellent education for every single student.
Beautiful, so you got the spirit of
Yeah, I
what you're
think
saying.
I have.
Back to Elizabeth.
Yeah, and I think I would just nuance it by, really, like, we're all individuals and we're gonna have barriers and challenges.
Right.
But that apart from the achievement gap for race, there's also achievement gaps for other particular, low-income students, students with a disability. And I think where those can be identified, they need to be called out.
Yeah, I think I the other one, and I thought this got brought up last time, but I looked back in the notes and I don't see anything, but, and this is a can of worms, I admit, but the whole every student succeeds, that word just grates on me, because by whose definition? And I think we have to be really careful of, like, success, a test score? No, I can't agree to that. What do we mean by success? And if not success, can we use a different, I personally, in my heart, and as a professional, an educational professional, I don't subscribe to what is considered to be success and non-success in our educational world right now. And I can't put my name on something that's going to perpetuate that.
But I think a lot of the conversation thus far has been around really restructuring that particular
But I'm just.
So it could be that, the PPS stated goal.
I know.
I'm not sure D-BRAC can change that, but it
but
doesn't have to be part of the wording.
But I'm talking about even the achievement gaps and stuff like that. It's, you know what I'm talking about. It's just, we are taking a predominantly white societal label and applying it to every single kid, regardless of where they come from, what their cultural background, their beliefs, and yes, that's I'm throwing a huge wrench in the works, but that is something that I feel in my gut. I can't, we just have to be really careful. I can't sign off on perpetuating these gaps when really, are the gaps there? What if we turned the system upside down and really started looking at it differently? I don't know that we would see the gaps, but it would make a whole lot of people uncomfortable. So, anyway.
And so.
Can I just add
Well,
to her comment, just really quick,
Sure.
because the stated goal on the website, which is the one I think we want, is by the end of elementary, middle, and high school, every student by name will meet or exceed academic standards and be fully prepared to make productive life decisions. That's the stated goal.
Again,
And you're
by
talking about
whose
the academic
definition?
standards.
Yeah, by whose definition? I really believe that a lot of, and I'm not just talking about PPS, I'm talking about nationwide.
Well,
I think we have
academic standards so you can graduate from high school, I think is what we're.
But again, our graduating from high school takes being able to pass a standardized test that is not appropriate for a lot of our students. I'm just saying that we have to be careful what we're saying because it has great meaning.
And so how do we, I see a lot of hands up, and as a facilitator, and you've labeled this as a can of worms. Clearly it is, and a lot of people have thoughts about this. What I want to try and do as a facilitator is make sure that we're focused, D-BRAC as a group, focused on things that D-BRAC has influence on related to boundaries, and that we are able to get enough feedback to our subcommittee so they can do some work between now and the June 4th meeting, so that we can be narrowing in and moving forward. Because this is a.
I think it has very much I think it has very much to do with what we're talking about really changing the playing field for a lot of kids. And yes, it's about boundaries, but.
And so what my request to those who have hands up, like
Hector and Sasha and Maxine. Let's go Maxine first. I saw yours first, and then Hector, and then Sasha. How do we talk about this in such a way that it relates to boundaries? And because that's what D-BRAC's focused on. Maxine.
I think in terms of that narrative that says to succeed, I think it's more about equitable and equal access to those educational opportunities that do lead to success.
Then that needs to be called.
Yeah, as opposed to every student should succeed, but you know, that they have equal access and opportunity to succeed. If you got some schools where you got 4 teachers and you got other schools where you have extraordinary teachers, then that's inequitable. So that's what we're looking at.
Or if you have a building that's overstaffed or understaffed, I know you have them in order, but I just have to tell you that generally speaking, if you frame it in that context, for me, this thing kind of rubs me the wrong way, the way it's coming out, because I think it doesn't call out what is at the heart of the issue, that over time, organizationally, for whatever reasons, not because people are not good people or well-intentioned people, that we have created an educational environment that has created impediments to certain populations accessing what we would like to have available for all students. And so, this is just me, and I think part of it is because I grew up in this, and I think that it would be helpful to put the work we are doing in some kind of in some kind of context that says 2010, 2012, because this is where we are now as a district and how we're going to approach it. We have done it differently in the past, same problem, but we have done it differently in the past, and I think it helps to have people understand we're not trying to integrate schools, which we've done in the past. We're not trying to create in isolation better schools, which we have done in the past. We are trying to approach the problem from a different vantage point, which is taking a look at how dividing boundaries to do what's at the bottom. But I think this whole thing that precedes that, for me, just kind of grates on me personally. Professionally, I get it, but as an African-American person who wasn't living in things that were traditionally home, I was redlined in that neighborhood, and that's where you lived because you couldn't get out of there. That's a whole different understanding of how I ended up in school X or Y or Z. So that's just kind of, you have to keep your audience in mind as well, as that's what I'm saying. So for me, that's kind of part of my struggle with being able to greenline this as a person, but as a staff person, knowing that I might end up having to help write it, I could easily flash up the green thing, because this is very hard to put in a document that can meet all the variations on the pages.
So Hector and then Sasha.
So Harriet has answered a lot of, so mine wasn't a question actually, it's more, if you have language about that, please get it to the committee. And what Harriet said gets at the, we don't have enough context here.
And I think I would say is please get me language that feels more comfortable, because Jason and I and Joe are rating, but we're just kind of, I don't have the language. I'm not an educator, I'm not a person of color.
I totally understand.
No, so, but I really want to get there, but I just don't have the capacity to do it, so you can send me scribbles or scrawls or whatever.
I'll be happy to do some.
But I
would be okay if it talked about access versus achievement.
The next page is really all about access, so.
I think we need to.
So Sasha and Jane, but maybe ready. Sasha's good, Jane?
I'd like to reference back to that draft 1A dated May 25th and comparing that to draft version 2. In context of this conversation, when we were first presented with what is draft 1A, I was very comfortable with the words found in B, which is every student in PPS has access. And for me, that gets to an equity discussion, has access. And then looking at C, that D-BRAC believes that every student can achieve and thrive. And that, I feel, gets to what I've been hearing in this conversation. So I'd like to advocate that those words, every student has access. And it's just every student has access. You could be purple and still have access. And then we pick up those words out of B and C and use them in that, addressing that achievement gap language.
So to jump in really quick, just to clarify, that particular language is on what is page 3 of the actual guiding values section. So that's still in there.
So we just need to change.
So let's go on to, I think we should capture what was said potentially and.
So, was there, Michael, did you have yellow?
I mean, I think most of the committee already covered it, so I don't want to rehash it.
Okay. So I noticed Pamela's written a lot, and I've taken a bunch of notes, and Hector and Jason have been watching their body language. I think they are feeling like they've got a lot of good feedback and are confident they can make some adjustments to this, this context section. And Tony was going to send a sentence or two, and Harriet was going to send some information, some wording, some language. So what I'd like to do is move us to the next piece, these guiding values, because definite portions of our conversation thus far will come up on this next page. So, Jason, do you want to do what you did with the first page on this one?
Yeah, so the voting procedure will be the same as we did for the context section, so I'll just read through this. I'll give everyone a couple minutes just to read through, and then we'll call for an initial straw poll vote. All right, so I'll call for the card vote. So, and the other thing I did, Kim did make a note to me really quick, which was the discussion that we had on achievement gaps for the context section. We'll make sure that is consistent with whatever language in the line that says equity ensures excellence for all students. Is that, so yeah. All right, so I'll do the same vote order. So any of those who are red, please raise your card.
So do you want to do the whole page?
Whole thing.
What's red again?
Red is you either you disagree with the language as written, or B, that the new language doesn't incorporate some things in version 1A that we need to make sure that we reincorporate.
You can say what yellow is.
Yellow is clarifying questions and grammar things that you will just note and send to us. Again, this is just PowerPoint. And then green is, do you agree with the intent or what is actually in fact there? All right, red cards. 1. Michelle. Yellow.
Is that every yellow or green?
I'm green.
That's a green.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 yellows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 yellows.
And green.
Greens. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Tony's another green. I threw it down maybe before.
He threw down the card.
All right. So there are 19 of us, but we only had 13 votes there.
I wasn't here last week,
Oh,
so.
that's like it is in the classroom, just to let you know.
And Pamela and I understand because we wrote it.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay, all right. Just,
Thanks, Alice. Thanks so much.
Does it really matter? 'Cause it
I'm
just gets all
observing
hashed
that
out
some of you
anyway.
can vote and you or do your card and you haven't. So if you want to add your card, you can, but you're not required to at this point.
Okay, Jim, so let's start with Michelle and Lorraine.
Yes.
That was my goal there.
So you're actually a yellow?
I'm joking. No, I'm joking. I have a value that that I think got lost. So F, and then 1A, diversity and demographics. Now, it's because it's not in the outcomes. So I'm back to I'm back to this whole values and conflicting values and making sure the list of values is complete. What I just want to say right now, personally, that I value diversity as a thing, right? That a school should strive to have, and that whole concept has just kind of gone away lately.
You don't see that
I don't see it in here.
For sure.
It's not in it, and it was sort of in it in the sense that we at least wanted the neighborhoods to reflect, the schools to reflect the neighborhood. But I'm thinking like, okay, we're drawing lines and we're basically gonna define the neighborhood. We're gonna redefine the neighborhood. And when we do that by drawing lines on a map, we're gonna say this is your school for these people living here. When we do that, I would like to value diversity in the sense that we make an effort to draw the lines in a way that increase rather than decrease diversity as an index, as something we can measure. And it's on this developing our document, diversity. It's got a check next to criteria. And I don't even know what that is. It's a red check. I don't know why it's red. Anyway, I would like to propose adding some language or discuss whether it's a common value even, because it's going to start conflicting with the common value of like belonging and community potentially, right? So I don't know where we're at with that, but I can't really deal with it being gone completely.
So, Sasha?
So, and Hector was there, and Emma and Jason jump in. We had a long conversation about the dangers of articulating that, because what ends up happening potentially is systemic social engineering, which we've seen in history of that not working well. And the place where we came, and again, please jump in, you guys, the place where we came to at the end was that each situation, like you can think of two situations where encouraging diversity in one situation may be beneficial, where in another it might go counter to our equity policy, depending on the scenario.
Well, it depends on the type of diversity you're talking about too.
It does. So what we were thinking was, if you use the equity lens, and by that I mean the specific equity lens, not a general one, I mean the tool that has been developed for this purpose, that you are then approaching each of these situations as they come, and you're asking the questions: who does this affect? Which groups are going to be underserved by the choices that we're going to be making? You really start to analyze and look at these problems on the ground at the time. Because when you make a constant rule, remember, busing was intended to be a good thing, I believe. At least in my hometown, I know that there was positive intent, because I actually was connected to the judge who did it in my family, and it didn't work out. And so those examples, of which I think there are many, give me anyway caution about putting hard and fast rules around this stuff. I think that you need to talk to the people who are affected, and I think you need to ask these questions in a thoughtful way when they come up.
Can we not have it as a value that might conflict? Though, I mean, none of this is really, there aren't any rules yet in this document that I can identify.
Yeah, this is a rough draft in a rough draft group, so I'm not in any way suggesting that's what this group should agree to. I'm just telling you what the conversation.
Okay, but is the group prepared to take the value of diversity out of the draft? I mean, I don't know. I'm not, but.
Kim's had her hand up.
I agree that the fact that the way it was stated, neighborhood schools should reflect, embrace, and meet the needs. I agree that that's shocking that it's not in here, like I think it should be. I would never ever be able to agree with what you're saying as far as changing, drawing the boundaries, specifically to create diversity.
Well,
One, I
not
think that,
just.
I think that you're only talking about particular parts of the city. So, and I think it would continue to perpetuate the fact that the kids that it would affect would be the ones that it always affects. And
But
that's
it's not necessarily racial diversity, it could be income diversity, so you could make an effort to, say, grab a group of low-income housing and put it into, or conversely, like in our neighborhood, keep all, if you didn't wanna do that, you could keep all of the students together and be aware of some of those factors.
Again, I'm with what Sasha said, I agree that the intent, I think that you were coming at it from a very altruistic point of view. However, I still think that we have to ask ourselves, is that fair to continue to ask different communities, whether it be of color, whether it be income, whether, whatever, ask them to be the ones to create diversity in our schools? I don't know, it just doesn't feel good.
I don't think that's what diversity is,
Oh, I just had
personally.
a quick, because you mentioned sort of grabbing like a low-income housing community, and I just wanted to say when I was working at Home Forward, there was a community, one of our properties in Southwest Portland that is currently zoned for a school that's further away from another school, and when people who lived in the community and worked in that community found out that I was on this committee, they specifically said over and over, please don't change our boundary. Like, don't send us to the closest school. Please keep us in the school where we've been.
Or together or something,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, and the school where they are is a Title I school, the other school is a wealthier
And
school.
this is where
That's like
conflicting values.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, so we have to be careful and we have to talk to affected.
So I'm wondering, and this is where as a facilitator you throw up trial balloons and then people tar and feather you, or they say, oh, maybe that'll work. So the district has this racial equity lens. Is it, would it be sufficient for somewhere in this document to be very explicit, saying the district has to use it in these kinds of circumstances? Would that be sufficient to sort of protect the value around diversity? I don't know, Pamela, it looked like you wanted to say something.
Well, just that, I think, and these may not be the right words, but the intent was that the sentence that currently reads, incorporation of racial equity policy and application of the racial equity lens to all of D-BRAC's work is the stand-in for what you're saying. It may not be the right language or the right level of hierarchy, but that was our intent, was to put that in as a process versus our value as a person.
So Sheila.
I guess my question would be, is that language sufficient to prevent what I would call gerrymandering, the application of the concept of gerrymandering to school boundaries, which would be that, you know, drawing lines so that you prevent any group from getting access to resources. I mean, we talk about the importance of access to resources for all students. Are boundaries a tool for achieving that? That's the question. Because some schools are more resource rich than others. We could say that's what needs to be fixed, the resource, and in fact, the survey addresses that question. Or we could say, we want the resources to be spread more equitably by adjusting boundaries. In the past, my sense from this group has been that that second option is not, with the exception of you, what the group agrees on.
About, sorry, could you repeat that?
That the group does not believe that boundaries should be used in order to provide access to resource-rich schools.
Because all schools should be resource-rich.
Well, because all schools, but, right.
But the
So-
fact of the matter is.
But the system isn't working
So
that way
I'm
currently.
not sure how, Hector had a hand up, but how long has the district had this racial equity lens
tool available to it? Has it been like 10 years?
Oh,
or-
no.
Maybe
3 to 4.
So 3 or 4 years, okay. So
And it's not widely
Work in
used.
process.
Yeah. I mean, so as I'm listening to this conversation, diversity is not the primary goal. Equity is the primary goal. And by calling out equity as opposed to diversity, it keeps us from either gerrymandering or setting up situations that are counter to the racial educational equity policy. And yes, by using the racial equity lens, it calls out for any decision which groups are disproportionately negatively impacted by any decision. And by the end of going through the entire lens, you also say, so what are you going to do to mitigate it? So that's my concern with placing such a high value on diversity as opposed to equity. So I would just say that.
So, Scott. So if we engaged in redrawing boundaries that ended up with, we had more schools that were more segregated by race and income, that would be okay with everybody?
I don't think so.
Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I don't.
That's the question I was
I think
asking,
that
but not as
I mean,
clearly
that's-
as you did.
We're talking about what values are gonna drive our process. So I don't know if that's a possibility, but I think it probably.
I think it could be, depending on how you drew the
But
line.
what if we go back to that language that it reflects the neighborhood?
But we're
Well,
defining a neighborhood.
But we're not. We're defining values.
No, by the lines define a neighborhood,
But we're not drawing boundaries. They are.
but we're giving them the values to draw the boundaries.
Right, exactly, where if we say demographics reflect the neighborhood.
That's not in the values anymore.
I know, that's why I'm saying if we put that in, that would only happen if that's truly the neighborhood. And it will happen at a lot of schools because Portland's a segregated city. So you are gonna have schools that are predominantly white, and you're gonna have schools that are predominantly black or predominantly Hispanic or mixed kids of color. That is going to happen because that's Portland.
Okay.
But I think that to spell it out, that the demographics need to reflect the neighborhood is a value, and it should be in there, and I think it would take into account what you're saying.
Not necessarily, because there are gonna be different options for drawing lines differently. And the question, I think, that we should address is, if you have a choice between line A and line B, that marginally probably affect the demographics at that school, should we have a guiding value that says more diversity depending on, or a closer reflection to the overall demographics of the district?
That would
Should
work,
we
too.
lean that way, or should we not think about it that at all?
I think the only reason a lot of times that people want to go to other schools is because of the quality of the school in their community. So if we work at making sure that the schools are all basically the same and offer the same opportunities and access to great education, then that shouldn't be an issue. I wouldn't, me being a person of color, I wouldn't want to go to a school where I would be 5 or 6 of a majority white school. I wouldn't want to be in that environment. And so I think people do tend to draw to environments that they're familiar with. So, but as long as the quality of the education is great in the district, it shouldn't.
Well, so I think I think there's a longer conversation than we're gonna
Yes.
do tonight. Because I think there's issues like that there's issues around greater segregation that we ran into with Sackett, that we have a transfer policy.
Yeah, you guys didn't solve it?
We had the silver bullet.
So I think there's.
I agree, and it
So we
conflicts with
also,
community.
we had 6 yellows
that we haven't gotten to yet. So we clearly identified, I think, this topic. A lot of people have weighed in on it. Scott, I think you're right. It's not something we're gonna conclude tonight. But we've got about 20 minutes left for this agenda item, and I think we need to hear from some of the yellow people with yellow cards. And we'll start on this end of the table this time. So there were 6 yellow cards. Michael.
It's just like small stuff.
Okay.
I was noticing.
That'd be good, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing big.
You think? I think they want to make sure the attendance is.
One conversation at a time, please.
It's just under the equity piece. It says elimination of the achievement gap. Is that a racial achievement gap? Because it was in the notes in the original.
So,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
So under equity, it says racial equity includes the elimination of achievement gap, and it had racial achievement gap initially. And then also just, I'm hearing this first subheading under racial equity includes, I'm hearing like language, gender, and students, and I feel like that's kind of separate from that. So I'm wondering if that could just be like a separate point under equity.
So mimicking what was there.
I see panelists making those. Anything else, Michael?
That's it.
Next yellow card was.
I didn't like equity and excellence all jammed into one thing. To me, I value equity and I value excellence, and I think they should be split. So that was my, and then I also thought it would be important again to include a value of differentiating resources in that one too.
Do you have a question?
I have a question, sorry. You said this a couple times, and I'm not really sure. What does differentiated resources mean?
So the district now has a policy that we provide additional resources for some schools that have.
Okay, so
you know what I'm saying.
continuation of that type,
Yes.
okay, sorry, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something.
Providing the resources that are needed by the community or by particular students.
Thank you, got it.
Anything else? Pam?
No.
Anything else? On to Jane.
This partners well with what Michael raised. There's the sentence that reads, or there's a clause that reads, racial equity includes. I would like to see the word racial dropped out of that sentence, just equity includes. Because what follows underneath that is the bullet point where it lists language as racial equity. But if I speak only French or only Russian, I'm still Caucasian. Language is not race, so I would just prefer that it be equity includes, or that that sentence get bifurcated.
It should be, it should be split.
I'm looking at committee members now. It's like,
Yeah.
So next yellow card person?
Oh.
Matthew.
So, one piece, I guess, I just thought the order was interesting, and I think reordering it from a process standpoint would work a little bit better, but if we're gonna bifurcate it, I don't wanna get into that. I guess my concern, and the main reason I put up the yellow card, was I don't wanna see, I understand and I agree with the discussion around the achievement gap and incorporating language about access and opportunity. I don't want to see that completely taken away. Because I feel like we're getting lost in a conversation about the particular measure of achievement. And from my perspective, regardless of the measure of achievement, there is an achievement gap. Whether it's a test or a graduation rate or job placement rate. So I don't want to see achievement gap and that idea get completely lost. I'm not sure where we landed on that. But I agree with including access and opportunity. Just so however it's modified in both the context and the values, I think it needs to be acknowledged and not get lost in a discussion about are we assessing achievement in the right way. Because I think they are two separate conversations. So that's my big thing.
So, Nectar, Jason, we were getting good head nods there. Next, Matthew, anything else?
No,
No?
that's-
Okay. Next yellow card, Shannon, was that you?
Nope.
No? Next yellow card person? Alice?
So mine is back on access, and it kind of speaks to my concern on the first page too. I like the sentence as it relates to drawing boundaries, so that there should be equitable access to resources like an academic program enrichment. But I also think that we need to somehow point to other processes or things that affect access, because access doesn't just mean physical resources or curriculum, it also means usability and interacting with the students. And so while that's not necessarily maybe something that boundary change would do, I think we need to reference that as a value, that access takes place in other ways and other parts of the system.
Yeah, and it actually addresses an issue that Sackett dealt with also, even those things that might, there was a point when Sackett members said, we can pull all of the levers that we want. If we don't get racially conscious teachers in front of all of our students, it's not gonna matter. And so I think as part of a context and a preamble or something, I think we'll find a way to get it in here and then have the entire group weigh in on it.
As a teacher, I have to speak up, because somebody said something earlier about excellent teachers in front of everybody. I agree, what was the phrase? I'm thinking culturally competent teachers, agreed. That is something that should be in front of every kid, regardless of where they are. What we have to be careful of is excellent teachers, because, again, we're going back to how are we measuring that? And if you take a teacher that is at a high-achieving school and pick them up and move them to a low-achieving school, expecting that they're magically going to be able to change things, that's not necessarily true. Because, one, you're still measuring by the same standards, so we have to be careful of that, of what we mean by excellent teacher. The culturally competent is good. On paper, I look like a really crappy teacher. But I guarantee you that in other ways, I can show success. So we really have to be careful of that. But I agree with the culturally competent.
So, Alice, any other yellow?
And I've practiced discipline
On
and
paper,
started
I
writing
look like
on a
it.
piece of paper. I'll send it to you.
Perfect. Excellent. So we've got about 10 minutes left for this agenda item.
The next one?
Yeah, let's move to the next one.
All right.
Did we know what these were?
Section 3, which is desired outcomes.
So we're shifting from values to desired outcomes.
Okay, so folks have had a chance to read through the desired outcome slide, so I'm going to go ahead and call for initial votes again. Any of those who are red, please raise your card.
Oh, reds, and we'll ask Sheila when she comes back in the room.
Okay, yellows.
So, I see, Scott, is that a real yellow or an attempted yellow?
Quick yellow.
It's a quick yellow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 yellows.
All right, and greens.
1, 2,
3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 greens. Sheila, we moved to desired outcomes page.
I had some.
And Jason had called red, yellow, or green. She'll add herself to yellow. So we have.
And Michelle.
I didn't vote, I'm voting.
All right. Late voters, putting it over the top. So yellow has pulled ahead of green, 8 to 7. So 0 reds. Let's start here. Jason, do you want to do the yellows again as we have been? Or do you, I'm sorry. So to frame that, if we do that, we probably don't have time to go through some of these.
And that other stuff is not a priority.
Okay. So yellows starting on this side of the room, Max.
I mean, and this doesn't need to be, we don't need to do a lot of discussion around this, but I feel like if we're putting so much work and clarification into access and achievement and that stuff, I feel like that should be part of our desired outcomes. I don't know, just reading this, if we're going to put so much into defining what it looks like to have access or achieve or have a something of that sort, then it should be in our desired outcomes.
Yeah, I agree.
I see head nods from subcommittee members. Do you have any others? Next yellow card person, Scott. The quick yellow card.
It's a desired outcome. I'd go with eliminate instead of minimize the number of. I'm not going to fall on a sword
I like it. Do it right or don't do it at all.
Right.
It's a desired outcome.
I think I heard 5 oohs and 2 ahs. Next yellow card person.
Please don't, I have to.
Shannon. What, Maxine, did you have a yellow card?
No, I had the same response last time. The next one, high rates of school-age children attending district schools, in particular their neighborhood schools. I think it should just read high rates of school-age children attending their neighborhood schools. I think that we've talked about it repeatedly, and I think that maybe it's my naivete, but I think the desire we want is kids going to their neighborhood schools.
Yep.
So I think focusing on the value that we want them to go to their neighborhood schools,
So
not district
Is this
schools.
talking about the overall district capture rate, is that what
It's
you were getting at?
not talking,
It's kind of two separate concepts.
People chime in here, 'cause it's.
Right, so then if
But,
we're talking about strong and stable enrollment in all schools, I really think that we're talking about two separate things in
Yeah.
this one statement, because I think it's really important that we are continuing to push our kids into their neighborhood schools. And I get I totally get the fit, and I get that there's some kids that, with our magnet programs, but I still feel like one of the reasons why I'm sitting at this table is to continue to remind us that it's the neighborhood schools. We want our kids to go to the schools that anchors their community. And so I think that strong and stable enrollment in all schools and its high rates of kids going to their neighborhood schools. I think that if we're talking about district-wide enrollment, that's a separate bullet.
Yeah.
I think neighborhood schools is a huge value that we need to really isolate.
Agreed.
I agree with that, yeah.
I agree.
Okay, Shannon, any other yellow?
Oh, that was it.
Next yellow card person, Sheila.
I thought that the bullet 2, not 1B, but 2, clear and trusted process. We talked about this a little bit earlier, and I think the concern was that the process be responsive also to what communities are looking for. In other words, we talked about the difference between having the same process versus having an equitable process, and those aren't necessarily the same thing. And I think a responsive might incorporate that. I'm not sure.
I think that also gets to one of the discussions that the subcommittee had, which was, I think we've acknowledged that there are multiple levers, but I think one of the things we're trying to also get at bullet point number 2 is being clear about if you have an issue where a building is over and under-enrolled, what is the actual, how is the district going to determine what lever is appropriate to use for that condition? And so that was kind of the underlying discussion that came up. So when we're saying clear and trusted process that determines when, it's like, that's the big, I think that's the sentiment behind why we have that language. But I think to your point is being responsive to the conditions that are there, but also ensuring that it's whatever the conditions that the lever that the district is recommending to use is the one that is actually going to actually do the job that the district wants it to do. Right.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was. Yeah, okay, so you get it.
I got it.
So next yellow card person, Michelle.
So I'm just gonna agree with Max that I feel like in general these outcomes need to be more concrete and defined. And like one thing I'm just thinking is that somehow, that right now, I think we've brought up several times, there's a lot of like one-off here and a one-off there and a lot of variability in the system. And so what can we measure or include that is reducing that variability so that it's a more predictable and a more stable outcome? And I don't know, I mean, we'd have to really talk about how you look at that. But I just think these are pretty kind of simple and vague or broad. I mean, I don't want to be like critical, but I just think they're not very specific. So if we were to say, oh, let's measure that, I don't know exactly what we would be measuring.
Well, and some of, I'm speculating a little bit here, and if Judy were here, she might think differently. I don't know. I've talked about this at all, but your desired outcomes at this point is advice to the superintendent and then to the school board. How that gets played out in a few months' time might get much more specific and concrete in detail.
Okay.
So my hunch is it will start to filter through like that. Any other yellow cards?
No, just on the previous slide.
Okay.
Just kidding.
So next yellow card person. James.
To that star, cross, whatever, a clear and trusted process, I keep going back to the language in draft 1A under predictability, which is H. And it refers to boundary changes which is predictable. I'd rather see a clear and predictable process, because to have it clear and trusted, one thing I've heard from you guys from day one is the process is not trusted. And I think trust comes from knowing what the predictable process is, what is going to use. Because I feel like with the word trusted, it's asking the receiver to trust, as opposed to the school district being able to say, this is what we're going to do. We're putting a responsibility on the receiver of the information, and we can't control how another person feels about anything.
The predictability, I guess I question that because it goes back to what, I guess it was Sheila brought up, that it isn't necessarily going to be predictable. It's going to depend on what school, what community, what kids.
So I switched on, if I could just say I switched on that by putting predictable about the process. I'm comfortable with it. When we were in earlier iterations, we were saying a predictable outcome. We can't guarantee predictable outcomes, but I think we can offer a predictable process.
Fair enough.
So thanks for that.
I understand what you're saying, but if one of the values is essentially the neighborhood school, that's always part of the process. And so you know that the process is that, and so that part stays predictable. But I don't feel like we can ask that we're trusted to be there.
Thank
so
you for
we're
the
at
clarification.
8:10, which is technically the end of this agenda item, but do we have any other yellow card people?
I just have a
here?
question about, and this came up earlier and it needs to be, I'm not an expert in all of this, so I don't necessarily know what all the enrollment balancing levers are. So where is that?
Next slide.
Oh, on the next slide. Okay.
Michael, did you have a yellow card?
Yeah.
Okay, last yellow card from Michael.
I think mine goes to kind of what you just talked about, kind of what Sheila was talking about. It's the second bullet point on the clear and trusted process. And for me, I'm looking at, like, when I think of that, I think of looking at the values. So I don't know if this goes under outcomes, or maybe the process is like transparency. Because I feel like you know, transparency of PBS, informing the stakeholders, and also engaging them in the process, so they feel like they can actually trust it because they're incorporated as part of the outcome for the solution.
And I think what the committee discussed, and it's on a little bit more issue, is that transparency is definitely a process. Like that we need to put it in our document, and we want it there, but we probably would have a process portion that's, we don't want to lose it, but we don't necessarily need to have it. And if you disagree,
Okay, so this group has done a lot of really good work for several meetings in a row. I've been watching our subcommittee members, and I think they have gotten a lot of good feedback to help them take another big step forward for next week. It'll be a similar process. They'll do some work, draft some things, send it to you guys ahead of time, read through it as best you can, be prepared with language changes. So, Jason, anything else you want to say wrapping this item up?
Not on this, the only thing I would say kind of looking forward is, one, thank you all so much for actually, when you've had comments, you've emailed them to both Pamela and I with enough time so that we can incorporate them. So we've only been able to do this as well as the ability of you guys providing feedback to us in advance. So thank you guys for really stepping up to do this. I think one thing also, two things in terms of the schedule. One is a reminder, on Wednesday, June 3rd from 6:30 to 8:30, we do have our forum with communities of color with the coalition. It'll be at Madison High School.
My last day, I can just hang around there.
Hey!
So I'll stay for a little bit longer.
You thought you were going to.
Yeah, I was out.
A little bit longer.
What did you see right there?
So in terms of that forum, I'll get you all a schedule in terms of what's actually going to be talked about at that forum, how the process of that will work, and your role in that. So you'll get that by end of day tomorrow. So keep an eye out for an email from me on that. And additionally, there is a schedule change for our meeting schedule, which is we did have a meeting scheduled on Thursday, June 11th, but apparently the board now has a meeting scheduled for that same time, so we are moving the June 11th meeting to Tuesday, June 9th, same time and location.
Is that still going to be a meeting with Carol Smith?
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
what it was, okay.
Yep.
Oh, wait,
So will we get like an email?
Yes, you'll get an email with the schedule changes and all that stuff.
So June 11th disappears and becomes June 9th.
Okay, but
Yes.
what about, I thought there was something about a change of the meeting with the superintendent.
That's it.
That's the one. Okay, I thought, okay, so, and what time is that?
Same 5:45 to 8:15, like normal D-BRAC meeting.
Same But we'll get an invite, right?
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks, Nick.
By the way, subcommittee, you guys are amazing.
I know, you guys are awesome.
Seriously.
So again, pink cards would be really helpful. We're zeroing in toward the end of this process. We really need to know what you need in your head to be able to give good advice to the superintendent. So the subcommittee has been doing a lot of good work. You've been giving them a lot of good feedback. Give us a little more feedback on the pink cards.
And I think that's it. So with that, we are adjourned right on schedule, actually 13 seconds early. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow, you are amazing.